May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Some years ago, some folks started to clear trees away from an area of land near my parents' home. And it was a pretty steep hill. We couldn't quite figure out what folks were going to do there. But after about a week or so, they had finished clearing out the trees, and it was clear they were trying to level the ground a little bit. And a week or so later, a big cement truck arrived and poured a foundation there. We could never figure out why anybody would want to build a house there. It seemed like a terrible place to build a house. But the foundation was poured, and then we waited. Weeks went by and nothing happened. We drove back and forth, back and forth. Winter came. Spring came. Nothing happened. We kept waiting and waiting and waiting for builders or somebody to show up. And finally, every time we'd drive by, one of my parents would start muttering about, you shouldn't start something you can't finish. And years went by and trees started to grow up in the middle of the foundation, and the vines took it over, and pretty soon it just disappeared back. The woods claimed what was its own, and the foundation disappeared. Part of this morning's gospel lesson is all about making sure you can finish what you start. And Jesus tells us those stories about the king who goes out to wage war, or the man who seeks to build a tower, ensuring you can finish what you start. But that's not really what Jesus is talking about. He's giving those examples in the context of a conversation about discipleship, about following Jesus, about being a faithful person of God. And what Jesus is saying to us is, if you start something, you better be willing to finish it. And it made me think about one of my heroes of the faith, who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. How many of you know Dietrich Bonhoeffer? A few? Good number? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a pastor and a theologian in Germany in the 20th century. He came from a very wealthy, elite German family. His father was a doctor and a neurologist. His mother was a pianist who had studied with Clara Schumann and Franz Liszt. And his family expected him to go on and become a doctor or a lawyer. Perhaps even someone who got into politics and work in a government. He was a brilliant man. And much to his family's chagrin, Dietrich decided to become a pastor and a teacher. His parents thought this was a terrible idea, but Dietrich felt God's call to him. He grew into adulthood right around the time the Nazi Party came into power in Germany. And as the established church in Germany went along with what the Nazis wanted to have happen and preached the word that the Nazis insisted be preached, Dietrich refused, and he spoke out on radio and preached publicly about the evils of the Nazi regime. And he started to gather other like-minded pastors and lay people around him. And they essentially formed their own church that broke away from the established church in Germany. Well, you can imagine the Nazis were not very pleased with Dietrich at this point. And things started to get very difficult for him. And so he accepted a post teaching in New York City for a little while at Union Theological School. And he came to the United States and shared his wisdom and his grace and his knowledge with students here. And went back to Germany. And then he went to London, and he served a couple of small churches in London. And when those 2 years were up, he went back to Germany. At this point, he was one of those folks the Nazis were watching. But even so, just before World War II started, they allowed him to leave the country again. I think perhaps they wanted him gone for good. He came back to New York. But he says in his writings that that was one of the worst mistakes he ever made. And even though his friends and companions and colleagues pleaded with him to stay in the United States, Dietrich Bonhoeffer went back to Germany in 1939. and continued his work and got involved in the German underground and those who were trying to overthrow Hitler and assassinate him. Dietrich was eventually betrayed and thrown into prison. And there, Dietrich Bonhoeffer continued his ministry with the prisoners, preaching and teaching every Sunday morning whenever he was able. And it was on a Sunday morning when the guards came for him and said, "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, come with us." And every prisoner knew exactly what that meant. And the next morning, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged at Flossenburg prison for his role in trying to assassinate Hitler. A man who was a pastor, a pacifist, a teacher, and yet his call to be a Christian disciple was so strong that when he saw that much evil in the world, he could not stay silent. And he paid the price for his discipleship. What Dietrich Bonhoeffer started, he saw through to the very end. Now, all of us became disciples at some point in our lives. Some of you, maybe like me, were baptized when you were a week or 10 days old, and your godparents stood up for you and promised that you would be raised as a Christian person. Maybe you were baptized later and made those promises for yourself. Or you got confirmed and reaffirmed those promises for yourself. Maybe you got received into the church. And that was again an opportunity for you to reflect and think deeply on your life as a Christian. Christian discipleship isn't something that happens all at once. It's something that we make choices about all the time. Sometimes they're great big events of big choices like baptism or confirmation or ordination. But the truth of the matter is we decide to be disciples every single day. You decide to be a disciple at school if you have the strength to stand up to a bully. You who work in business have the opportunity to choose to be a disciple every day when you conduct your business with honesty and integrity. Those of you who are busy raising your children make the decision to be disciples every day when you choose to raise your children in the best way you know how, and to serve God through raising faithful young people. We all make the decision every single day to be a disciple of Christ. And most of us are never going to face what Dietrich Bonhoeffer faced. Most of us are never going to live what the Syrian Christians and Palestinian Christians and Egyptian Christians are living right now in other parts of the world, where their churches are being burned and they are being killed. Most of us don't live those kinds of lives. But we still have the opportunity, and we are called to live as Christ's disciples every single day in those small decisions that we make, in the places where we choose to put our bodies. My mentors used to say, 3/4 of ministry is just showing up. It's where you choose to put yourself. When people are struggling, when children are being bullied, when there's inequality that we see around us. The grandmothers for peace who choose to stand out on the corner. The folks who chose to protest against Prop 8. And those who stood with support for the Supreme Court decisions this fall. It's where we choose to be and how we choose to be there that makes us disciples every single day. Luke has preached some pretty tough words to us these last few weeks, and they've all been wrapped up in this idea of discipleship, of hating your father and your mother, of your children, of leaving your possessions, not bringing peace but discord. And what Luke is trying to say to us is that being a disciple is hard, and being a disciple takes work every single day. And being a disciple sometimes means stepping out of the places where we're comfortable and the places where we know, and into a place that is uncomfortable and hard and we don't know. But if it is a place where there is God, and there is a place that we are making the right choice to be a disciple, then the one thing we always know is that God is there with us. walking with us, encouraging us, and looking on us as the disciples that we're each called to be. Amen.